Okay, and welcome to Hashem's podcast, early morning in Adelaide, very early in Melbourne, and late on this side of the world. So, our topic this evening or morning, wherever you are, is climate change a scam? So, let's delve into a conversation with scientist and Professor Ian Plimer, who is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, the Australian Institute of Geoscientists and Australian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy, an honorary fellow, Geological Society of London, member of the Geological Society of Australia, the Royal Society of South Australia, the Royal Society of New South Wales. Professor also worked at the University of Melbourne. Today, we're going to be talking about why he rejects the scientific consensus on climate change, and he also has been a critic of creationism. So, there's a lot more to talk about your bio, but I'd rather hear it from the man himself. Good morning, Professor Ian.
Good morning from Adelaide. How are we?
Good morning. So, let's talk about when did you first get skeptical about the whole climate change idea, and when did you begin going against the grain, I guess? Because 97% of scientists say there is such a thing as climate change and it's caused by CO2 and all that sort of stuff. So I've watched a lot of your work. I've read some of your books. I think it's fascinating. I think it's very interesting. You talk about many different things about, you know, it could be a scam. It could be, uh, let's begin from there. When did it begin for you, the idea?
Well, skepticism underpins science. If you're not skeptical, then you can't be a scientist. And you have to be skeptical about the data you collect, how you collected it, when it was collected, who collected it, and how you interpret it. So I just use my natural scientific training to ask simple questions. And the questions I started to ask in the 1990s were, well, okay, you're giving us this idea that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive climate change, but what about the past? In the past, we've had ice ages, and these ice ages have been at times when we've had very high carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So how come? How can this work? There's something fundamentally wrong. And that was in the 90s. And in a book that I wrote called A Short History of Planet Earth, I think it came out in about 1999, I was questioning the view then that was just starting to appear in public, and that was that humans can change climate, can change a major planetary process. I just don't think the evidence from the past agreed with that. And if you can't stitch the past in with what's happening at present, then you've got a real problem. So at that time, I was at the University of Melbourne. We had a number of meteorologists in the department that I was head of. And these people fairly quickly morphed into becoming climate scientists. And I thought, well, that's a bit unusual. This is something we've never heard of, is climate science. And it was very clear that that's where the research monies were. And it was a case of follow the money. Now, as for the 97% of so-called scientists who support this thesis that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming, that is a survey done by a chap at the University of Queensland some years ago, and he surveyed about 10,000 people, most of whom said, go away, we're not interested. And a few of those people were genuine meteorologists and climate scientists, but a lot of them were activists and people such as those from Greenpeace and other organisations. And a few hundred replied to his survey. Now, these are people with a vested interest. These are people, many of whom know nothing about science, and they all put up their hands and said, oh, yes, we agree with climate change. Well, I do too. The climate has always changed, and it's changed dramatically. It's changed very quickly, and it's had very large changes. And in the past, this obviously could not be related to humans because humans weren't around. So the questionnaire was faulty. The questions were not well framed, and those people who profit out of being a climate scientist were asked the questions. and those in the other sciences, the life sciences, the other earth sciences, physics and chemistry, etc., were not asked. So this figure of 97% has become entrenched. It's a total biased figure. It has nothing to do with science, because science is married to evidence. And the evidence of the past says that well before we had humans, we had climate change, we had warming, periods of warming which were much longer and hotter than now. We had cooling, during which time we had very high carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's obvious that carbon dioxide cannot drive climate change. So from very early on, from more than a quarter of a century ago, I realised that this was a scientific con, and it was all related to people hoovering up research monies and staying alive. And many of these people were mathematical modelers who are eminently unemployable, and this was a mechanism of them being able to create a little niche for themselves. So a long time ago, I was skeptical, and I was doing what scientists do, is ask the simple questions.
Based on evidence and fact and history.
Based on evidence. Yeah.
Right. So the culture of fear about, this is the hottest year on record and all that sort of stuff. The coldest year on record. What record are they discussing?
Well, they're only discussing a very biased temperature record, which is fairly recent, and that temperature record has been modified, and that temperature record has always been modified upwards. So the hottest days now we see are in very, very recent times. But we know from temperature measurements that the 1930s are much hotter than now. We know from looking at temperature proxies that in the time of Jesus, it was much warmer than now. And then we had a cold period. It was much colder than now. That was called the Dark Ages. Then we went into a warm period, the medieval warming, where for about 300 years, wow, it was warmer than now, about 4 or 5 degrees warmer than now. And then we cooled into the Little Ice Age, and we're coming out of the Little Ice Age. What do you expect happens after we come out of a Little Ice Age? Is it going to cool down or is it going to warm up? So the statement that this is the hottest summer ever or the hottest day ever doesn't tell you when measurements were started, how measurements were made, and what the past looks like. And just in the historical past, we've seen periods of time which have been much warmer, much wetter than now. We've also seen periods much colder than now. If you look in the past that we can obtain from drilling into ice cores, in the ice cores we have snow that has fallen. When that snow is falling, it captures very small bits of air, and that is compressed into ice, and that air is trapped in the ice. Yeah. And so if you drill a hole through the ice, you can work out where you are in time by looking at the material left behind by dirty big volcanic eruptions, and we can date when those formed. Then you can take out that little bit of air, and you can work out what the air chemistry was. And then from various chemical tricks, you can work out at what temperature the air was when the snow fell. So we find that we have cycles of temperature in the ice core record, and these cycles are interglacial periods, which are about 10,000 years long, and glacial periods when it's about 90,000 years long. And we find that in the past interglacials, they are all warmer, and they all have temperatures that lasted much longer than the present period of warming, which started in 1850. So again, when you look back in the archaeological past, we find that those ideas of the hottest time ever are incommensurate with the data. And then, of course, if you look back into the geological record, which goes back in further time, we can see that there are some very, very long hot periods. These very long hot periods we see by desert sands, which are now a sandstone. We see from various plant life, and you can work out from the leaves how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere. We can go right back in time with the temperature record, and probably the best temperature record we have is over the last 20% of time. And we see that in that period of time, we've had 3 ice ages, 3 periods when it was very warm. And over that period of time, over the last 20% of time, we've had the atmospheric carbon dioxide content warming. We've had temperature going up and down. And for the last 50 million years, we've been cooling with the odd spike of warming. And these spikes of warming, we know from proxies and from history, were periods like Minoan times or Roman times or medieval times or the modern times. And then you're stuck with a question which is never been answered. And that is, well, which part of the modern warming is natural and which part of the modern warming is due to human activity? Because when we look at the modern warming, it's not as long and it's not as intense as previous warmings, which were well before humans had been using industry. So these fundamental questions don't get asked. People make bland statements, and these statements get parroted by the media, but these statements have no substance. So when we hear about today is the hottest day since so-and-so, or today is the hottest year since 700 years, you have to say, well, let's go back and look at the past. And those statements always turn out to be absolutely, totally wrong.
So, one of your most prolific books in 2009, you were criticised for your book Heaven and Earth by The Guardian, of all places, all media outlets. So, calling you dodging valid criticism. And it was one of your most popular books. How did you respond to that back in 2009?
Well, that was the book Heaven and Earth. The Guardian, God bless them, if they criticise you, that's a badge of honour. The third thing is that the person who criticised me was the zoologist and journalist George Monbiot. And George is slightly unbalanced. And I hadn't been criticised because that was the first time I'd put out a book on this subject. So how in the hell could I be criticised if I hadn't put out a book? What he was really saying is that there are many of the things that I wrote about climate in the past for which he had no answer. Therefore, he had to say, oh, well, he's going against the popular paradigm. He's been criticised. Well, at that stage of my life, I hadn't been. And so that book had to be criticised and had to be criticised intensely because it was an international bestseller. It sold about 150,000 copies. It had to be criticised because people read it and thought, hey, hang on a tick. This bloke's using geology, he's using archaeology, and he's using history, and he's putting it all together, stitching it together, and demonstrating that humans could not possibly be driving a major planetary process. And so it actually changed a lot of thinking, and I had to be silenced. I was one who was influencing people to have a different view. So every loopy organisation around, The Guardian, the ABC and others, had a go at me. Well, criticism in science is normal. But irrational criticism is not normal in science. And this was irrational because they were not using evidence and they were not using the past, which is the area I specialise in.
Yeah. And what about all the titles you've held? You've been at the WS, LW, Robertson University, College of New South Wales, Broken Hill.
Well, I've moved around a lot and it's been a career. I started a career in a fairly junior position in a tutor and senior tutor in Macquarie University in Sydney.
Yeah.
I then went to a university college of the University of New South Wales, and that was because my interest is in minerals, and so Broken Hill is the home of minerals, and to go to the Robinson College in Broken Hill in that period of time was to win the lottery. After that, I went into the mining industry. I was based in Melbourne with North Broken Hill Limited. After that, I had a fairly traumatic event being a passenger in their corporate jet at 31,000 feet. And we ran out of fuel and we crashed. We crashed into bushland. I survived. I then I'd had an offer from the University of New England to go there. So I thought, oh, gee, I've got 3 young kids. Maybe I should stop flitting around in corporate jets and get my feet in the ground. And so I went to the University of New England, but only for 2 years. And then I applied for the chair at the University of Newcastle, and I won the chair there. I became the professor and head of department. I then went to the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich, and there I was the Lehrstuhl von Lagerstättenkunde, which is the chair of ore deposit geology. And that was a very serious promotion to go from being the professor at Newcastle to the professor in Munich. And then that was a time when the University of Melbourne was looking for professors who were Aussies, but who lived elsewhere and worked at other universities abroad. And so I went to the University of Melbourne in 1990, late 1991, I think it was. Yes, late 1991 or early 1992. And I was a professor and head there for some 13 years.
Wow.
And I was a tenured professor and head. But
Yeah.
I then had an offer that came from some of my mates in the mining industry here in Adelaide to say, well, look, in Adelaide, we are trying to build a new department of mining engineering. We don't have anyone in mining engineering to be in this department, to run it. You're a geologist. You've worked in the mining industry. You do understand mining engineering. And so I had a joint effort by the South Australian government, the University of Adelaide, and some of my mates in the mining industry to come to the University of Adelaide. So I gave up a tenured professorship at the University of Melbourne to come to a short-term contract position at the University of Adelaide, simply because it was a challenge. I'd never built a new university department. It was exciting. And so I was at Adelaide. I renewed the contract. And then after that, I thought, well, I'd done my job. And I'd been pressurised for a long while to join Mrs. Gina Reinhardt's group of Hancock prospecting companies. So I joined them, left the University of Adelaide, and that was a dozen years or so ago. So I've had a career where I've been in and out of the mining industry, where I've moved up the academic scale. I've been a full professor now for some 30 years.
Did you ever meet the great Lang Hancock?
No, I never had a long conversation or dealings with him, but I met him very briefly at the Roebourne pub in Western Australia in about 1966.
That's so interesting.
And he now is dead, but his daughter Gina doesn't remember it, but I certainly remember it, because you don't meet a person like Lang Hancock in your life and forget it.
Yeah, definitely. So let's go back to just for our audience to sort of understand where we are with the understanding of climate change. How is it seen? How's it been seen? Is it a warming versus cooling idea? Is it just about warming?
It's about neither. It's about cycles. We have cycles of climate, which are very long-term and very short-term. So the long-term cycles are every 400 million years, we pull apart and stitch back together the continents. Now, what that does is that changes the way the ocean currents flow. That changes the way heat is distributed around the planet, and that changes climate. So the position of continents is extremely important. We currently have a continent at the South Pole that is separated from the other continents. So we have a current that goes around the South Pole and stops warm water coming from the Northern Hemisphere and from the equator to the South Pole. And that continent is actually breaking up. And so underneath the ice in Antarctica, we have about 150 geothermal areas. We have various volcanoes. So we have one set of cycles of climate, which is every 400 million years. And then every 143 million years, we're in the wrong galactic address and we go through a massive ice age. And we've got records of that going back thousands of millions of years. And then the Earth's orbit changes a little bit. Sometimes we're a bit closer to the sun, sometimes we're a bit further away from the sun. And so every 100,000 years, 40,000 years and 20,000 years, we go through an orbital cycle. The 100,000 year cycle is where we go from an elliptical to circular orbit. The 40,000 year cycle is where the axis of the Earth changes a little bit and we get further away from the sun. And the 20,000 year cycle is where we wobble a bit like a top. So we have orbital cycles, and then we have solar cycles, and the sun puts out a variable amount of energy. So we go through grand solar maximum and grand solar minimum about every 10 years, and we've just been through a grand solar maximum every 10,000 years, should I say. Then we have cycles which we've known for 300 years. These are cycles related to sunspots, and they're on multiples of 22 years. And these sunspot cycles are very, very well recorded. We've got cycles that have been optically measured with telescopes going back 330 years. Very, very recently, there was a Martian cycle that was found based on the orbit of the Earth around Mars, and that was every 2.4 million years. Now, I'm yet to see more evidence on that. So in my mind, the jury's out on that one. But we have oceanic cycles every 60 years, and these are so prominent that the Chinese actually manufactured a calendar based on these 60-year cycles because they could correlate this with their harvests and their bad harvests. And our correlation is that we know that every 60 years people can go through the Northwest Passage in wooden boats. We know that we have climate changes on a 60-year cycle. We've also got oceanic cycles where we push in warm water into the Arctic, and that's every 18.6 years, and that's related to the moon. So we have all these cycles of climate which are very well quantified and been known for hundreds of years. On top of that, we have random events such as a dirty big asteroid impact, which will put a lot of dust into the air and will cool down, or a huge volcanic eruption that will put dust into the air and will cool down. And we know that. We've got records in history, such as the year without the summer, 1816. That was related to a big Indonesian volcano. We know that from the Pinatubo volcano in the Philippines, and fairly recently from volcanoes in the Pacific. We know that we can put a very large volume of water up into the atmosphere. Now, we've only just learnt that. We've only just learnt that when you put a lot of water into the atmosphere, you actually change the temperature record over a decade or two, that you have massive rain bombs, and that these would never, ever been able to understand in the past. But we had one fairly recently in Tonga. So we were able to monitor that from space and from the ground and work out, wait a minute, if you start having a big submarine explosive volcano, it can actually change climate. So climate is cyclical and climate is accidental, and it's related principally to the sun. If we're close to the sun, we're warmer. If we're further away from the sun, we're cooler. Yep. That's the first driving force. And the second driving force is where the continents lie and how currents operate. So if someone says, is the planet warming or cooling, I'll say yes. It's both warming and it's both cooling, depending upon the time scale you're looking at. So if I'm looking at over the last 50 million years, planet Earth is cooling. If I'm looking over the last 150 years, it has been warming with 3 spikes of warming, 2 of cooling and 1 of stasis. And we're probably now starting a phase where it's starting to cool. This is quite normal. Temperature doesn't stay static. And this is an idea that goes right back, way back in the past, that the planet is stable, the planet is static. And if there's a change, it must be due to humans, these sinful humans doing something. This is a religious idea that's been around for a long period of time. So I argue that the whole concept of climate change is not science at all. It's actually a religion, and it's the new green religion, which doesn't need any evidence. All it needs is ideology and belief, and that's what religion is.
Okay. All right. What about things like population, wars, volcanoes? Are these all impacting the change that we are seeing? So, I mean, like Channel 7 had the other day that our summers are getting longer. Eventually, summers are going to go into mid-June in places like Melbourne and Sydney. It's sort of happening. If the weather is changing. How do we answer that? I mean,
well, the weather
already
always changes, and if Channel 7 want to promote that idea, I want to see what's been happening to summers over the last 2,000 years, because we've got a very good record of it.
Okay, so we need to go
this
back.
Is just media hype. This is totally unrelated to reality. They get some scientists chasing a research grant saying that mathematically can show that over the last 10 years, summers might have been getting longer. Well, they might have been, but they haven't been over thousands of years or millions of years or thousands of millions of years. The summer length changes due to the orbit of the Earth. And we humans, no matter what we do, can't change the orbit of the Earth. The length of the day has changed over time, as has the length of the seasons. And that is an orbital feature that's unrelated to anything humans do. As for volcanoes, well, volcanoes can have a significant effect on populations. We know from an eruption about 1600 BC in Santorini, that wiped out the Minoan Empire. And the Minoan Empire was in Egypt, it was in parts of what is now Turkey, all through the Cyclades Islands. That was the dominant civilization. And they were greatly weakened by the volcanic ash that fell on them from the Santorini eruption. They were greatly weakened by the tsunamis that hit them. And the Athenians or the Mycenaeans took over, and then the Athenians. Now, if we had had that volcano, we would have had a different civilization on planet Earth. So one volcano can ruin your whole day. Now, we know that from supervolcanoes. Supervolcanoes have had a profound effect on climate, and they've had a profound effect on civilizations. Yeah. The last great supervolcano that affected humans was the Toba eruption about 70,000 years ago. And at that period of time, we had 4 species of humans on planet Earth. 3 of them became extinct. We went down to about 4,000 breeding pairs. We very nearly became extinct. That volcano occurred during a cooling phase. We started cooling 116,000 years ago and reached a maximum in the ice age in the glaciation about 20,000 years ago. We were in a cooling phase. We suddenly filled the atmosphere with dust from a supervolcano, and these are ones that, instead of putting out about 30 cubic kilometres of rock, which they pummel up into dust into the atmosphere, they put out thousands of cubic kilometres. And we think that with Toba, it put out about 3,000 cubic kilometres of rock into the atmosphere that was broken up into dust. So that cooled the planet. We had 3 human species become extinct. We very nearly became extinct. It led to massive migrations of people around the world. And this is probably the time when the Aboriginals first came into Australia. They had to get out of an area that had been destroyed by a volcano. There was nothing to eat. So we know that volcanoes can change civilization. They have in the past, and they will in the present. And we have some massive volcanoes waiting to go in places like Central America, Kamchatka, up in Washington, up in Oregon area, up in the North Island of New Zealand. These are super volcanoes which have exploded in the past, and they will in the future. They've always changed the world, and they'll continue to do it. So they change things. Wars, of course, change the world. Wars depopulate the planet. Warming times actually end up populating the planet. And we know from a record of 32 million deaths related to climate that this medical study showed that 90% of climate deaths are related to cooling, not to warming. And we know that because in our culture, we've got stories about Jack Frost. We've got stories about people dying in cold weather. So we've known this for a long while. And if you really want to have a good understanding of climate, just read history. So if Channel 7 are putting out a story that our summers are getting longer and eventually we're going to have summer go right into June or July, this is just media hype. They're not responsible for anything they say. There are no consequences for what they say, and they move on to the next exaggerated story. This is so people can watch Channel 7 and buy the products that they're flogging. So if someone makes a claim, you've got to say, oh, that's interesting. Show me. And then the second thing is you say, well, what's happened over the past? Show me what's happened. So we're living in a media world with an enormous amount of hype and exaggeration, and I'm not so sure that this is a source of reliable information.
Yeah, and you're a brave man, Professor Ian. I mean, NASA disagrees with what you're saying. We live in a world, we're bombarded with, environmental.
Well, NASA don't. There was one group in NASA that is funded by the climate lobby, and the rest of NASA don't. A few weeks ago, I was at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, just north of Los Angeles. Yep. These are major laboratories which are involved in heavy-duty physics. They don't disagree. It is only people with a vested interest, and these are people who are mathematicians modelling or meteorologists who have suddenly called themselves climate scientists. They depend upon research grants to stay alive. They're the ones that make the noise. Those of us in chemistry and physics and astronomy keep our head down and keep working. We just don't deal with these trivial matters. It would be very difficult to find an astronomer that would differ from my views. There are thousands of geologists going out there finding mineral, coal and oil deposits. They're too busy to be involved in the public sphere. And for them, this is just absolute nonsense. So the squeaky wheels are out there all the time. But I am in the majority. I'm in the majority in the community, and I'm in the majority in the scientific community.
Wow. So do we ignore like environmental friendly warnings and products and solar
No,
energy
we
and all?
argue. We
Argue.
argue. That's what
Yeah.
science is about. You argue using evidence. And if the evidence is insufficient, you go and collect more. If evidence you have is incommensurate with evidence that someone else has promoted, then you argue. But the only solution to that is to get more evidence and also to repeat what you've done.
Yeah.
So science is never settled. And as soon as we heard the mantra, science is settled, the science of climate change is settled, we knew that we were being conned, because that is an illogical statement, and it's certainly not the way science works. Science is married to evidence. If you reassess the evidence or get new evidence, you will come up with a new conclusion. Science can never be settled. And once you say it's settled, then that means it has become propaganda.
Absolutely fascinating. Just before you go, so what's the future hold for the, because I mean, I'm surrounded by the whole climate change world that we live in, sustainability, it's said all the time. Is it going to keep going, or are they going to just stop one day and say, no, we made a mistake, or we didn't know. Professor Ian was right. Is that ever going to happen?
Well, the first thing is no one will ever admit to making mistakes. So what will happen is it will be quietly shelved, and those who are engaged in this fear campaign will move on to the next scare campaign. They will not actually say, oh, bloody hell, we got this one wrong. They will move on, and the world is full of people um, having these great causes and then moving on to the next cause. When that's finished, they move on to the next cause. They never say they're wrong. They never say that that cause has cost trillions of dollars. And this climate change propaganda is a new religion that's cost the Western world trillions of dollars. It has put a lot of people out of work. It has destroyed a lot of common sense industry that's taken thousands of years to evolve. And we can only do that because we're at a stage in history when we're wealthy. We can only do that when we're at a stage in history where people are fairly ill-educated. And so people will not say they're wrong. They'll just move on to the next fad. And these fads become the fashions, and they're followed by fools and frauds. So we'll never hear that we were wrong. We'll just quietly drop it and move on to something else. Now, you can see that happening now. You can see governments are not using the word net zero. They're not using the word sustainable. They're moving on. They're concerned about where do our hydrocarbons come from. If we didn't have hydrocarbon exploration, then we wouldn't be able to run hospitals. We wouldn't be able to actually have agriculture. And all of a sudden, people have realised how stitched in hydrocarbons are to the modern world. Now, we know that if you're drilling for gas, sometimes that gas will have a little bit of helium in it. You will extract that helium, and that helium you use as an inert gas for cooling medical equipment. Without helium, you can't run a hospital. Without petroleum and gas, you can't actually create plastics. You can't create urea for a fertilizer. Without smelting and converting sulfide rocks into metals, you can't create sulfuric acid, and so you can't have phosphate fertilizers for food. So these chains have been around for a very long period of time, and understanding these chains was the reason I got into science. And so if someone comes up with a new idea and all of a sudden we find, bloody hell, we can't feed ourselves, then people just quietly drop it and move on to the next scare campaign. God knows what it will be, but there will be a lot of people who believe it. And belief is a word of religion and politics. It's not a word of science. So that's the way the world works. We work with these big scare scams, these big campaigns where we get everyone involved. We saw it with the Dutch tulip craze centuries ago. We saw it with the South Sea bubble centuries ago. People follow these fads and end up losing a lot of money. And that's exactly what's happened with the climate scam.
Wow. Absolutely fascinating, Professor Ian. Let's have another chat soon when you have the time. It took a while to get you. You're all over the world. I'd love to chat with you again. And I hope our listeners
We
we'll
will.
listen. Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you so much, Professor Ian Plimer, all the way from Adelaide. And you've been listening to Hashem's podcast. Hope it was interesting. Have a good night and good morning where you are. See you soon, Professor.
Thank
See
you for
you.
having me.
Thank you. Bye. I'll send you the link when it's done. I'll put it up now.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, send John the link also.
I will.
Yeah, John Killick. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
Excellent. I'll have another morning coffee and then I'll get into the day's work.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. All the best. Cheers. Bye.
See you.